Mark believed he was falling in love with Helen. He had several classes with her, and, when not in class, found she was constantly in his thoughts. She was a striking girl with a pale, pretty face and large gray eyes, which looked directly at you when she spoke, and she wore her thick, honey-brown hair piled atop her head, completely different from the other girls. Helen dressed casually but with a certain style, and wore square-toed boots, tight jeans, and a dark vest over men's dress shirts. And she was both intelligent and witty, and best of all, seemed to find Mark interesting. They had a class together on Friday afternoons, and afterwards, Helen, Mark, and some of the other, scholars went to the Brock University pub for a brewski. On this particular Friday, Mark sat next to Helen, and they had an animated discussion about some Harold Pinter plays they were reading for their modern theater class. And as they were leaving, she asked him if he would like to join her and some friends on a trip over the river. Over the river. Now, to a Brock student, going over the river meant a tour of the watering holes of western New York, where booze was cheap and the bars stayed open late, i.e., like until 3 o'clock in the morning. He said yes, of course. Mark was ecstatic at being invited. But his enthusiasm dimmed soon after Helen picked him up in her Nissan Rogue. Problem 1. Helen had 2 other guys in tow. One was an African exchange student named Darwin, who never opened his mouth, and the other was an obnoxious guy named Kev, who never shut up. Mark's relationship with Kev started out like this. Kev, loud. You're a drama student, eh? Mark, yes. Kev, that's kind of for losers, eh? Mark felt like saying, if that's true, how come you're not a drama student? But instead he said, I find it interesting. Things went downhill from there, made worse by Kev drinking from a crock of Jack Daniels. Drinking from a crock of Jack Daniels in a moving vehicle heading toward an international border. Lovely. Just fucking lovely. Problem 2. They were no longer going over the river. Instead, they were heading for the Screaming Tunnel. The Screaming Tunnel. The Screaming Tunnel was in Thorold or Niagara Falls, depending on your source. It was a limestone drainage tunnel running under a rail line, built sometime in the 1800s. It was called the Screaming Tunnel, as a young woman, fleeing a fire in a nearby farmhouse, ran into the tunnel, her nightie ablaze, and died screaming in agony right in the middle. They say if you strike a match on the spot she died, you'll hear her scream. But no word if the trick would work with a Bic lighter. Other versions of the story ran, A. Girl was the victim of incest, and her father set her clothes on fire when she threatened to go to the police. B. Father burned the house down after losing custody of the children during a nasty divorce. Girl managed to escape, only to die in agony. C. Girl was raped and murdered in the tunnel, and her body set on fire to destroy the evidence while she was still alive. All in all, the legends were pretty distasteful. Mark had heard them all, of course, but he had never wanted to visit the spot, and he didn't want to visit it now, At least not with this crew. But Helen wanted to go. And with a Ouija board to try and contact the dead girl. Mark didn't believe in the supernatural, and he also felt screwing around with a Ouija board was kind of juvenile. But he was stuck now. Unless he wanted to make the long walk back to his lonely room. The tunnel was just off the side of a quiet road in an isolated, semi-rural, semi-industrial area. And unfortunately, the place was deserted, as Mark had hoped they might give up if there were other people hanging around. No such luck. The place stank like shit. And naturally, no one had thought to bring a flashlight, so they had to use the lights from their phones to guide them. And they needed the light, as a stream of smelly water ran right down the middle of the subway. In fact, it was so damp, Mark wondered where Helen was going to set up the Ouija board. They made their way to the midpoint of the tunnel, the spot where the young woman allegedly died screaming, the spot where striking a match would make the girl's ghost begin screaming anew. Of course, Kev had to try it, striking his way through several matches before he got one to stay lit. Nothing happened, but Mark was surprised the flame didn't cause the putrid miasma or the fumes from the jack to explode. Eventually, Helen got the board set up, and she knelt along with Kev and Mark, and the three of them put their fingers on the movable planchette. But not Darwin, who stood a foot away from the board, either from fright or disinterest. Helen asked the standard question first. "Is there anyone here?" The planchette moved to yes. Kev leaned over to Mark and, blowing whiskey fumes in his face, said, "You're moving it." Helen shushed him, then asked, "Did you die in a fire?" Again the planchette moved to yes. "Were you murdered?" Yes. By now even Kev could see the planchette was clearly moving on its own accord, and he told Helen to ask the spirit who killed her. "Who murdered you?" The movable disc began to move and spelled out H-E-L. "No," Mark said instinctively, as the planchette continued to spell out E-N, Helen. They all looked at each other as Darwin slowly began to back away. And that's when the screaming started. The smell hit them first, the acrid aroma of burnt meat. The darkened archway of the tunnel was suddenly filled with a blaze of yellow-orange light, as a giant flame appeared at the far end of the underpass and actually began to move towards them. It was a young woman, arms raised as if to embrace a lover, and she was on fire and shrieking like a banshee as she ran forward. Mark heard a sharp intake of breath, and turning saw Helen. Saw Helen was also on fire, and had started running to meet the burning girl. Mark looked to the others for help, but Darwin had already taken off, and Kev was standing like a statue and filming the scene with the camera on his iPhone. "God! Oh, God!" he kept repeating over and over. "God! Oh, God!" Mark jumped after Helen and threw his arms around her, planning to take her down and hoping the damp, dank earth would help him put out the flames. But the instant he grabbed her, Mark suffered a violent shock, his eyes blinded by intense, reddish light, and his flesh seared with agonizing pain. And then it was over, and he was holding Helen tightly, and she was no longer on fire. and the burning girl had vanished. Yet the screams still echoed in the tunnel, and they could still smell the stench of charred flesh. They were alone. After a minute, Mark said, "Are you all right?" "Yeah," Helen answered weakly. "Let's get out of here." They found the Rogue where they'd parked it. Both Kev and Darwin had completely disappeared. "Are you okay to drive?" Mark asked. Another week. Yeah, I'm okay." They drove back to town in silence, and from time to time, Mark caught a whiff of cooked meat. But he kept his mouth shut and said nothing, not even when Helen dropped him off. Alone in his room, Mark lit a cigarillo and smirked as he poured himself a shot of, Fireball. And as he sat and smoked, he thought about Helen and how his prospects for romance appeared to have gone up in, flames. Ha, ha, ha. But Mark was sure as to the reality of the screaming girl. The sounds, the smell, the heat had all been real, and he was equally sure Helen had been a pillar of fire until he took her in his arms, when he too had felt the burn. He poured himself another shot and said, out loud, "Guess you shouldn't screw around with spirits and Ouija boards." Mark was right about his romance. It was over before it started. He continued to see Helen at school, but they didn't sit together anymore and didn't speak beyond the occasional hello. She left at the end of the semester, and he never saw her again. But several years later, when Mark was having a quiet beer at a local bar, a guy at the end of the counter kept staring at him and finally said, "Your name is Mark, right?" Turned out it was Kev. "Thanks for taking off that night," Mark said testily. He had no interest in renewing his acquaintance with Kev. "I've never been more scared in my life," Kev said, without the least hint of embarrassment. "But you want to know the worst part? The worst part of all?" "Not really," Mark said, planning to drink up and go. "You saw how I was filming everything with my phone, eh?" "Yeah." "Well, when I went to look at it later, there was nothing there. No girl, no flames, no screaming, nothing, just us guys yelling. Nothing. But there was a burning girl there. I saw her. Shit, I smelled her. And Helen, she was on fire too. It couldn't have been a hallucination, eh?" Mark got to his feet, shrugged, said, "I don't know." Then Kev concluded, "Guess you shouldn't screw around with spirits or Ouija boards, eh?" "Indeed. Yeah. Let the dead rest in peace, unless you have a burning desire for paranormal enlightenment." WSJ here. Thanks for listening. I lived in the Niagara region for 4 years, but never heard about the Screaming Tunnel until I moved 2,000 miles away. I guess that shows the power of the internet. As for me, on this channel, I write and tell original Canadian weird tales and creepypastas. If you enjoyed this video, please share, comment, I'll answer, drop a like, and subscribe for more horror and horrible puns. And I really appreciate the support of all my wonderful subscribers. And remember, never screw around with spirits or Ouija boards. Stay hungry.